Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Thoreau with the C.S. Lewis Society. We're delighted for you to be here with us this evening for this special presentation by José Yulo on Mere Christianity. I apologize that we cannot host live in Oakland this evening. Both I am in Massachusetts and Graham is in Virginia, so we can't be there. We'll be back in 2 weeks when we will be reading The Reason for God by Timothy Keller, with Paul Ashby leading us. We would ask, since this is being recorded and Jose is doing a special presentation, that you would mute yourself until he opens it up to questions. And without further ado, Jose, I think we'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Good evening to everyone and greetings on the West Coast, East Coast, in between, and overseas as well. I'm very happy to share with you the second installment of Mere Christianity, one of Lewis's most well-known works. And the method of presentation tonight will take the form of what I like to call the Grand Tour. It is something that I learned from an old Yulo family friend from way back in the Philippines when I was a young man, that Yulo family friend being a Jesuit priest called Father James Donnellan. He was president of the Jesuit University in the Philippines. Before that, he was a scholar of English literature at Oxford University in England. He used to present his version of a Grand Tour, which was back in those days, not too much high tech. So it was a slideshow presentation from pictures. And they were pictures that he took on his travels through Europe. So it could be a piazza in Florence, a cathedral in Venice. He would take pictures of sculptures, paintings, buildings, and churches, and explain to you what went into the making of these works of art, but at the same time explain to you what were the goings on of the time, what were the people of the time thinking about in terms of aesthetics, in terms of philosophy, perhaps politics and technology as well. It gave a very three-dimensional education with regards to whatever subject matter he was presenting on, and I hope to do the same, or at least parallel that, in my presentation on Lewis today and Mere Christianity. So to that end, we will be showing various pictures of visuals of works of art and correlating these to passages from Lewis and seeing perhaps if the art can illumine some finer points that Lewis is writing about to perhaps provide another perspective, but by no means taking away the profundity of Lewis's writing. So that being the case, we begin with 4 parts, actually, was our presentation for tonight. It's divided into 4 parts. The first will be, just so you know, the first of these will be a general theme of Lewis introducing the 3 levels of morality in Christianity. Lewis introduces something that has many working parts, but working parts that work well together. So again, the first part of the presentation will be the 3 levels of Christian morality. Second part of the presentation will be a word spent and a little bit of time spent on an old pagan, by that I mean Greco-Roman virtue. So not a theological virtue that we learned from Lewis and that we've learned from Aquinas and Augustine, etc., but an old cardinal virtue. That one called prudence. I sometimes will also call that wisdom. So that is the second part of our presentation, touching on how the ancients pre-Judeo-Christianity viewed goodness and virtue. We transition from that to the third part of the presentation, which of course tackles the opposite. We will be looking at pride, how Lewis talks about this as perhaps the greatest of all sins in that sense. And then finally, we transition to perhaps the antidote to pride, what he discusses insofar as charity is concerned, one of the 3 theological virtues. Okay, so that's basically the breakdown of subject matter for tonight. First, again, is the 3 levels of Christian morality. Second is a word on prudence and wisdom and Greco-Roman pagan morality. Third is the study of pride by Lewis. And lastly, the theological virtue of charity. And we'll see how all of these sort of flow into each other. They sort of lead into each other in terms of a discussion. All right. So for the very first part, beginning with the 3 levels of Christian morality. Again, this is my copy of the book. If you have a similar version, it's this one right here. I'll take you to page 72 of the reading, so 7-2. This is under the heading or the chapter called The 3 Parts of Morality. If you have a different page, that's okay as well. It is a paragraph beginning with morality then. Folks all on the same page, more or less? Okay, cool, great. I'll begin with this paragraph. Morality then, according to Lewis, seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole. What man was made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. Slide into the next paragraph. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. I'll repeat that one because it's a rather telling line by Lewis. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. So what does Lewis mean by this reading? Just to encapsulate, Lewis starts a paragraph reminding that in modernity, it is only level one, harmony between individuals, that is thought of. The following two, the proper ordering of the individual, and thirdly, the ordering ourselves to our proper goal, or perhaps as the Greeks would call it, telos, our purpose. Those two are neglected. The latter two are neglected, according to Lewis. We tend to focus on the first part. It's a natural question, I guess, that comes to mind, at least for me, is why would this be the case? If you have the patience for a mild Socratic question, I was weaned on this from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, so I always try to inject these every now and then within the lectures. What do you think about this? Is Lewis correct? And why is this the case? Why do we only focus on the harmony between individuals?
I was supposed to fit in with a utilitarian approach.
Okay. How so?
And in that what you're interested in is not necessarily the truth or falsity of morality, but its usefulness for ordering, for harmonizing between individuals or ordering societal relationships.
Very good. With regard to utilitarian thought, this deals with something being useful, yes? Like a quality being of use to a society. Could it be safe to say that the reason we in modernity focus on the first part of what Lewis is talking about, which is merely the harmonizing of each individual to each other, not bothering about the ordering of the individual, nor our telos or our goal, is a possible answer from what Bob was saying? I'm just building on that. Is it possible to say that it is easier to only focus on the first part? I mean, obviously it's only one, but it's that specific one. We could have focused on the other two parts. But Lewis is saying in modernity, we tend really just to focus on the first part, on mere harmonization. Well, if it is easier, it is also historical. Simply correcting errant behavior is as old as Hammurabi's code. That's in the Bronze Age in Babylon a long time ago. Harsher and harsher punishments are the answer for more and more cruel crimes. But not too much was done back in ancient Babylon to address the inner constitution of a human being. Not too much was done to address why someone would commit a transgression. The ancient Greeks would do this one step better, one step more refined, perhaps. A good friend recently passed away, was a professor of government at Georgetown University, Father James Scholl. He once told me over a lunch many years ago that it was amazing to see how far the Greeks got without the aid of revelation. In the sense of literally just using their rational capacities, how far they really achieved, how far they got in that process. The Greeks got this a little bit better, of course, than Hammurabi's Babylon. An example, perhaps the greatest of the Greek tragedy writers, Sophocles, at least that's the opinion of Aristotle, that he was the greatest of the three, wrote a lesser known tragedy called the Ajax. Ajax was a great warrior in the Trojan War. He was second only to Achilles in strength and might when you basically broke down all of the great heroes on the Greek side. But Ajax, in a fit of despair, because he was made a fool of by the goddess Athena, takes a gift to him by the great Trojan warrior Hector, the tamer of horses himself, gifts his own sword to Ajax because he is that mighty, he is that worthy of respect. But in a fit of despair, because he has been driven a bit mad, in a sense, by Athena, Ajax falls on this sword. He tells his family he will go to the beach to make peace with the gods, and he literally falls on the sword that was a gift to him. Now, technically speaking, if we're only doing Lewis's first level, yes, and again, Lewis says we in modernity only bother ourselves with that first level, then aside from Ajax, there's nobody else really being hurt in the process. He's hurting himself, but there is no disharmony with somebody else. But here is where the Greeks fall short a bit in that thinking. Where the Greeks fall short is in the third level that Lewis talks about, the level of orienting ourselves towards our final goal, or our telos, or purpose. How we fall short is because of the nature of the Greek pantheon of belief. Since the gods of Olympus are capricious and caring and uncaring, one has but to read the Iliad to realize that the gods basically play with people like chess pieces. There is little in the way in Greek thought, at least in Greek mythology, of a salvific telos, of some sort of salvation as our final purpose, other than basically following our own fate in that sense. Where Christianity takes the lead from this is in presenting an end goal, a telos, as something at the end of the line that we are made for, wherein harm ultimately is rendered obsolete. I will now share a picture on share screen from our slideshow. This is a painting by Anthony van Dyck, who of course was a rather famous Flemish painter. He is second only to Peter Paul Rubens with regard to being the most well-known Flemish painter of the 1600s. This is called The Betrayal of Christ, by the way, and it was painted between 1618 and 1620. It is housed, at least this version, I have seen other versions, but this particular version is housed at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. A very good museum, by the way, should you be in that part of the country. Van Dyck was born in 1599, which meant that he was a very young man when he produced this painting. He would have been about 19 years old when he produced this painting. He is considered, of course, like Rubens, who I mentioned earlier, to have taken a bit of inspiration from Italian sources. Rubens was influenced by the Italian master of realism, Caravaggio, which I will share with you, of which his work I will share with you a little bit later on today or tonight. But whereas Caravaggio influences Rubens, Van Dyck was very greatly influenced by Titian, the greatest name in Venetian painting, and we will see elements of that a little bit later. Eventually, Van Dyck will become more famous because he produces work for the English court, for King James I and Charles I of England. Now, looking at the subject of the painting, called The Betrayal of Jesus, of course, or the Betrayal of Christ, when we look at this painting, we notice that Judas is central to this painting. He occupies the most space, the largest space in the painting, as far as an individual goes. Now, if we apply what Lewis is talking about with regards to level 1, level 2, level 3 of morality, we will note that looking at Judas and what he's doing, if simply following harmony amongst people, in this case, if simply following the law is all that is important, if not creating legal disharmony amongst individuals, if that is the main goal, then there is frankly nothing altogether wrongful about what Judas is doing. In fact, not only is he following the law, so to speak, but he is also being compensated by the law. He's being paid to do what he's doing. Yet, when we look at a deeper level, Lewis's number 2 level, which is the ordering of our own interior constitution, we notice that there are, of course, there are things awry in this act. Judas betrays a friend and a teacher, one who has done him kindness. This leads to his punishment, if you are familiar with Dante's Inferno, in the ninth circle of hell, where the greatest punishments are meted out. That is specifically a place reserved for those who betray their benefactors. Cassius and Brutus, of course, who betray Caesar, and of course, Judas, who betrays Jesus. They are being gnashed in the teeth of the devil himself, buried in ice, who is himself, of course, the greatest betrayer in this sense. If we look closely at the painting, Jesus is showing the expression on his face, a sense of pity in the way that he is, or perhaps even restraint in the way he is viewing Judas, who is betraying him in this section. And notice, by the way, that above Jesus's head is a cord of rope that is about to be used to bind him. He is clothed, Jesus is, in red and blue. Now, again, please remember the reference earlier made towards Titian being the influence of Van Dyck. Titian was very famous for his use of deep colors, of deep reds and blues, very much emblematic of Venetian painting. Now, Judas's actions are perhaps due, just hopefully an educated guess, are perhaps due to a sense of internal discord. He was the keeper of the money among the apostles, which may have led to him falling for the lure of acquiring quantifiable gain in this world, in spite of the gift of eternal life in the next world. This is akin to, this can be said to be related to, it's an old Latin verb, invidere, where we get the word envy. It means literally looking at someone askance, in a way measuring them, quantifying their value. My former dean at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, Dean Eva T.H. Brand, wrote a book called Equality, and asking the question if it is an absolute good. It is a book available. It's a very good one, and she breaks down this analysis of envy as applying quantifiable viewpoints towards those things which are not quantifiable. Obviously, math is quantifiable, but human beings are a little bit different than that. So perhaps Judas falling prey to this interior sense or this interior discord. We spoke about akatastasia last week, this sense of discord and confusion within the soul, which leads to bad decisions. Perhaps that is an example of Lewis saying that you need to take care of the interior part. Judas's interior part is not working all that well at this point in time. But what about point 3? That point 3 being what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. This is perhaps addressed by the scene at lower left. I can draw your attention right here to what looks like a scuffle that is happening at the bottom of the painting, bottom left of the painting. There is a struggle between two figures, one who we don't see his eyes because they're sort of shaded over, but another who, if you look very, very closely, has a face and eyes that look, if I could use the term, that look infernal, that look perhaps diabolical in origin. They are wrapped in a struggle. We don't exactly know who these figures are. Now, one could conjecture it may be Peter, usually chopping the ear of one of the servants. That could be the case, but Van Dyck paints it almost standing by itself. And notice as well the very vibrant blue colors used with the top figure. This struggle seems quite serious. And by the way, some tells with regard to the figures, if you notice the hands of this bottom figure, akin to a painting we saw last week, these almost look like talons, not merely hands. Hands with claws attached at the end of them. They are wrapped in a struggle, these two figures, and perhaps represent the choices we make to follow the tune established by the conductor. Of course, Lewis would argue that is God. Taking responsibility for one's actions is, of course, part of this. Judas in Matthew 27 does this eventually when he renounces the 30 pieces of silver, but nevertheless gives into despair and ends his own life. It is worthy to note, by the way, that when Judas returns the pieces of silver to those who paid him to betray Jesus, they say, I think it's still in Matthew, they make the point of saying we cannot use this money because it is blood money. So although it is a legal action and Judas is compensated by legal authorities to do what he did, they still acknowledge that there's something, how should we say, there is something not quite right with this money. They then turn to use the money to buy a potter's field. So even at that moment, there is an admission, a silent one, perhaps not an overly loudly spoken one, that there is something wrong beyond mere law in that sense. If we in modernity, wrapping up this portion of the presentation, if we in modernity only subscribe to the first level of morality, which Lewis again calls merely harmonizing ourselves to each other, then we do not place ourselves in a situation where we can order our inner constitutions and take responsibility for playing the conductor's tune. Before we move on, I'm more than happy to address any thoughts you have on the material so far, on the painting.
Where is Judas?
Right here in the middle. About to give the kiss. We see Jesus looking at him, quite solemnly, but admitting that there is something quite sad that is about to happen. Any questions or comments on this before we progress further? All right, we've covered so far the three levels of morality according to Lewis. The next part of the presentation shall be, will regard looking at and examining briefly an aspect of virtue that is not found from theology, that aspect found in the old Greco-Roman Persian world. 1 second, let me just look at the chats just to make sure I didn't lose anyone. Yep. Bob, I think you're asking the question. Are you asking this of me? Is this your wife on Zoom? Yeah, my wife Joyce is right there. She is my final editor and very much my guide when I do all this research. I thank her very much for being here. She's right there. Everybody say hi to Joyce online.
I've not met her before. All the times you've spoken to her.
Okay, very good. Very good. Okay, so the second part of our presentation will deal with looking at the cardinal virtue of prudence or wisdom. If I could direct us to page 77 of the reading. In my copy of the book, page 77. Very top of the page, if you locate a paragraph beginning with prudence. Do you guys see that? Prudence means practical. So if you open up the chapter called the Cardinal Virtues, it is on the second page of that. Are we all good, more or less? Okay. So from that paragraph, prudence means practical common sense, taking the trouble to think out what you are doing and what is likely to come of it. Nowadays, most people hardly think of prudence as one of the virtues. In fact, because Christ said we could only get into this world by being like children, many Christians have the idea that provided you are good, in quotations, it does not matter being a fool, But that is a misunderstanding. In the first place, most children show plenty of prudence about doing the things they are really interested in and think them out quite sensibly. In the second place, as St. Paul points out, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. On the contrary, he told us to be not only as harmless as doves, but also as wise as serpents. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. In viewing the potential difficulties found in navigating through Christian morality, we have tools left to us from older times, from the time before Christianity. The pagan cardinal virtues are recognizable by all. This is what Lewis is saying, that there's no sort of civilization that is immune from recognizing these virtues. Are recognizable by all and are pivotal in the sense of pertaining to the hinge of a door, perhaps implying the capacity to go in one direction or another, to own the benefits or costs of one's actions. Lewis calls prudence practical common sense. This is an interesting term that he uses because, of course, Lewis was influenced by G.K. Chesterton, and G.K. Chesterton is often called the apostle of common sense. Prudence does, it involves thinking through what one does and its possible ramifications. Though Christ did not mean for us to be innocent, this does not mean he meant for us to be ignorant. One can err by being too much the serpent or too much the dove. We are called upon, according to Lewis, to be both. For our second work of art, this painting is found at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. It is called The Abduction of Rebecca. The artist is Eugène Delacroix. It was painted in 1846. Delacroix was a quite famous Romantic era French painter. He was good friends with a composer you may have heard about, Frédéric Chopin. A bit of a favorite of mine is Chopin and his brilliance on the piano. This painting shows Delacroix's skill in the use of color. He is, of course, most well known if we think of Delacroix's work. If you are familiar with the painting entitled Liberty Leading the People, that very emblematic painting during the French Revolution, where the female figure leads the crowd basically in storming the Bastille, perhaps, or storming the ramparts during the French Revolution. That is what Delacroix is most known for. He was inspired not necessarily by artists or painters, but he's inspired by writers such as Dante and Shakespeare, and the Middle Ages as a whole as well, which gives us the meat of this painting and what it is trying to portray. And this painting is based on a novel written by the Scottish author Walter Scott, written in the 19th century, about a story or a tale that is supposed to have happened in Crusader times, so around the 12th century or so. The novel by Scott that influences Delacroix is called Ivanhoe. Just on the side, if you are familiar with the old Ivanhoe movie from the 1950s with a very young Elizabeth Taylor and the great Robert Taylor, this was, of course, a very good rendition of this story. In this painting, Rebecca, the Jewish healer and heroine, is abducted from Torquilstone Castle by the Saracen servants of this knight right down here. He is a Templar knight, a great warrior priest called Briand de Bois-Guilbert. Bois-Guilbert craves Rebecca's love and resents the fact that she loves another man, the good guy of the story, Sir Wilfrid of Ivanhoe, the Saxon warrior, who, of course, is the mortal enemy of Bois-Guilbert. In an effort to literally seize her and her affections, he takes her away from this castle and towards the refuge of his superior Templar knight, the head man of his order, thinking that she will be protected and hopefully he will be able to win her affections in that setting. Unfortunately, this move by Bois-Guilbert, which he believes to be clever, to remove Rebecca by force so he can have her to himself and hopefully woo her in that setting, does not work out quite well. At the Templar order, the head of this order says that because Rebecca has a reputation for being a healer, she must also be involved in some other infernal crafts, and therefore she ought to be burnt at the stake. Now, hearing of this, Bois Guilbert has to pivot. Again, pivoting or like a hinge of a door. Bois Guilbert is very clever, and he says, okay, there is an old part of medieval law that says you can appeal to the court and ask for something called the right of trial by combat. That is where you ask for a champion to physically fight for you against the champion of the court. And whosoever wins this contest of might, that will be who God is declaring the right side in this conflict. So Bois Guilbert sends a message to Rebecca saying, ask for this right, and then I will be proven as your champion. I will volunteer. You can use me as your champion. I am the greatest fighter of the Norman knights. I am better even than Ivanhoe. Therefore, you will be saved because of me, and perhaps you love me because of this sacrifice. Unfortunately for Bois Guilbert, his superior, the head Templar, says once he hears of this issue of trial by combat, he says, okay, well, Bois Guilbert, you will be the champion of the court. Now, why is this a very bad thing, of course, for the planning and scheming of Briand de Bois Guilbert? Well, frankly, if he fights on the court side and he wins, well, then Rebecca dies. Compounding the grief of Bois Guilbert is Ivanhoe, the great Saxon warrior, stepping in to say he will champion Rebecca. Bois Guilbert dies as a result of this decision, losing both his love and his life. He did not have the prudence, he did not have the wisdom to see he could not force Rebecca to love him. Or that he did not have the prudence, of course, also to see that his untempered love, his violent love for her would lead him so far astray. A true hinge moment. Think of that definition used by Lewis with regard to a cardinal virtue. A true hinge moment in the life of the story's villain, and quite a compelling cautionary tale as well. Focusing on the painting, Delacroix's use of color evokes Venetian painting. Now, Venetian painting was criticized by an early art historian, a man called Giorgio Vasari. I believe I mentioned him last week in the presentation, or 2 weeks ago. Vasari was very critical of Venetian painting because he did not believe it rose to the level of Florentine painting, the likes of course, Michelangelo, Botticelli. What distinguishes Florentine painting is that drawing is very, very important. Clear lines separating figures is very, very important. Venetian painting, when we think of Tintoretto, when we think of Titian, there is more of an emphasis on color than of line. Now, Vasari might think that that Delacroix is using too much of a Venetian influence, and therefore this painting looks a little messy. The lines are not overly defined. Even the view of the castle in the distance, we don't really see. Well, we have one vertical line over here, but the rest of the building sort of fades into the distance. However, it is arguable that this works well for Delacroix because the use of swirling curves, all of these non-linear perspectives, all of these serve to evoke this violent action happening, and the use of color aiding this as well, in this process. Briand de Bois Guilbert, the great Templar knight, mistook what he believed to be cleverness for wisdom. Now, those are two very, very different things. Yet, I would argue that perhaps, even though they are virtues, the Greco-Roman cardinal pagan virtues, perhaps they have a blind spot, a spot where they are vulnerable, a spot where something may inject itself to not necessarily corrupt the virtue, but corrupt the person who possesses the virtue. If we think of it in this way, the Greco-Roman pagan cardinal virtues are things that are sought after by people. In the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, Aristotle brings up a man he calls the great-souled man, or the proud man. This person exceeds everybody else in terms of virtue. He is more virtuous than everybody else. He is given honors because other people see him as more virtuous than them. If you're familiar with Aristotle and how he views ethics, what is good is usually found in the mean, or in the middle between two extremes. When we think of the virtue of courage, a courageous person is neither a person who has no fear or a person who is overcome by fear. Rather, a courageous person, according to Aristotle, is someone who feels the fear but continues anyway. So it's in the middle. Now, the proud man of Aristotle, one who has the most virtue, he is also in between two extremes. On one end is the unnecessarily humble man, the man who thinks that nothing should be deserving of me. I'm not really of that much value. On the other end of the spectrum is the, how should I say this? The man who is overwhelmed with bravado, with arrogance, believing himself to be deserving of things that in reality he is undeserving of. So the proud man, or the great-souled man, has the most virtue, but he is in the middle of these two extremes. But he also is above the rest of the people. So you almost have an XY axis in that sense. He exceeds everybody else in terms of virtue, which is what makes him special. Now, there's a possible blind spot to that. Because the Greco-Roman pagan virtues are seen as things that you can acquire, that are seen as things that you can earn, that you can have and possess, they tend to separate people from each other. When a person is finally found to be, by someone else, wise, well, what does that mean? That means that there are also unwise people. When a person is found to be courageous, that person stands out amongst a sea of people who are either non-committal or not so courageous. They are exceptional. These virtues make you exceptional and basically different from other people. Most importantly, these virtues separate you from other people. They serve as divisions between you and others. Instead of building greater relationships, they distinguish you by the nature of them being virtues, by the nature of you being exceptional because you possess these virtues. So perhaps this is my little argument. Perhaps this is a blind spot in the great virtues, by the way, of the ancient world. There are four of them. Prudence is one, also called wisdom. The second is courage or fortitude. And then you have temperance, the ability to control your bodily urges. And lastly, you have justice. These are not small things. They, in fact, are rather good things to possess. I've mentioned Father Scholl before, who taught at Georgetown for many years. He once told me, it's typical of the way he would word these intellectual dilemmas. He once told me that justice is a virtue. It is a great virtue. But justice is the most terrible of virtues. With justice, there are no loopholes. If a person lives a wretched life, the outcome of that life will be likewise wretched. In a manner, the Greco-Roman pagan virtues almost are asking, voicelessly asking perhaps, some sort of remedy that later on the theological virtues will provide. They will provide complements to the Greco-Roman virtues, the four needing the three, in that sense. I believe this line is taken from Augustine. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure. A line where Augustine says, with regard to the Old Testament, the law was given that grace would be sought. The law was given that grace would be sought. And then he says, with regard to the New Testament, grace was given that the law may be fulfilled. Grace was given that the law would be fulfilled. Obviously, the law has great use, and it is beneficial for us. But at times, we could fall into the error, which Jesus points out in the New Testament, of being overly fixated on law, in not having the intentionality there of wanting to be loving towards somebody else. Therefore, the law was given in a manner that we would ask for something more. So one could say, in a parallel sense, that the Greco-Roman virtues were established, were acknowledged, but they were established and acknowledged in a way which ultimately asked for something more, which asked for something that was more forgiving, perhaps, that was perhaps more generous, that was perhaps more caring, based on sharing the relational value as a human being. This is the second part of the presentation tonight, where we talked about the cardinal virtue of prudence or wisdom. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have on either the painting by Delacroix, the tragic story of Briand de Bois-Guilbert, or the points that Lewis, of course, was bringing up with regards to prudence. More than happy to address anything if you have any questions or comments.
Looking at the painting here, and as a clinician more than anything else, I'm just looking. You're looking at colors, and I'm looking at light, and I'm looking at the breast of the lady, for what you can see, but also the breast of the champion, or who wanted to be champion. They're almost identical here. Like there's something like a love or some kind of connection there that I hadn't noticed before, and I've seen this painting before as well. So, just a comment.
It's a fascinating comment in the sense that perhaps Delacroix is establishing some tie between Rebecca, the woman that Briand de Bois-Guilbert loves, and himself, of course, and the knight, but with the idea being that they have the same perhaps lighting attributed to their bodies, but note that they are not together. There's a definite separation, of course, by the distance, of course, involved, and the people involved, the other people, the two Saracen servants of Bois-Guilbert. There is a separation between them and between the object of Bois-Guilbert's love and himself, perhaps showing us or sharing the message that these two will never be together.
I was just going to say, your point is well made by the person standing on the right, who's looking at Weber as like he's dismissing him or threatening him, get him away. You know,
he's actually the servant of the guy riding the horse. So they're sort of packing Rebecca onto another horse to escape this burning castle. Rather interesting, of course. The distance again between them and the people in between, serving as impediments of this love.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. We will have our second part begin after a very short break. We will cover, of course, what Lewis describes as the sin of pride, and later the antidote to pride, that being virtue of charity. Hello again to everyone. Now we move on to our third part of the presentation. And this segues a little bit from what we just covered before break, which is the nature of the cardinal virtues sometimes being vulnerable to something called pride. So this is the chapter in which Lewis will discuss this. There is a page from our text, page 121. So 121, you should find a chapter, it's chapter 8, entitled The Great Sin. First paragraph beginning with, I now come to that part. And this is from Lewis. I now come to that part of Christian morals where they differ most sharply from all other morals. There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I have heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone who was not Christian accuse himself of this vice. If we go to page 122, this train of thought is followed on the next page. From page 122, the paragraph beginning with, does this seem to you exaggerated? Middle of that paragraph or so, you should find the sentence beginning with, Now what you want to get clear. Now what you want to get clear is that pride is essentially competitive, is competitive by its very nature, while the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. I'll repeat that line because it's rather telling. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. And the last in this train of thought is found in the next page. These all sort of flow into each other, although they're separated. This is from the paragraph that begins with, take it with money. Take it with money. I have page 123 for that. If you scroll down a little bit, about midway through that paragraph, a sentence beginning with, it is pride the wish. It is pride, the wish to be richer than some other rich man, and still more, the wish for power. For of course, power is what pride really enjoys. There is nothing makes man feel so superior to others as being able to move them about like toy soldiers. Let's tie these all together and see what Lewis is saying about pride. The interesting thing about the first sentences of the chapter where Christianity is most starkly contrasted to other moralities is the focus on the vice which holds no exceptions for people of any belief system, according to Lewis. We are informed of its existence by spotting and resenting its presence in others. We tend not to like overly proud or braggadocious people. It is the essential vice, according to Lewis, the utmost evil, because it is essentially competitive. It is relational with satisfaction only derived from having more of something than someone else. This also ironically means pride is isolating. It leaves one alone because one's pleasure lies in spiting others. Pride's end is power. Its telos, its purpose is power. The ultimate superiority, to be like the gods in Homer's Iliad, who play with mortal lives like chess pieces. Or perhaps, if I can draw an older example, to succumb to the temptation from Eden, ye shall be as gods. This leads, pride does, to viewing anyone or anything that is superior to oneself as the enemy. I'd like to share this work of art with you. This painting can be found at the Uffizi Museum in Florence. It is called Bacchus. It was painted by Michelangelo Merisi, also known as Caravaggio, in the year 1598. Caravaggio, when he painted this, was at the earlier point of his career when he was being supported, and his patron was the cardinal, very influential cardinal, Francesco Maria del Monte. He was very influential. Caravaggio was, of course, in his use of realism in art. He was a Baroque era painter. There are many who were influenced by them. Rubens, of course, was one I mentioned earlier. The presentation we had last week, I showed that painting of Saint Peter being interrogated by Gerrit van Honthorst, a Dutch painter, also influenced by Caravaggio, his dramatic use of light, coupled with the hyper-realism of his painting. You could almost touch what he's depicting with oil in the paintings. Let's work with this painting. Perhaps it's the most famous of the ones I've shown, or perhaps most well-known, but let's try to work with this one from bottom up, starting from the bottom and sort of progressing upwards. From the bottom of the painting, we see a sumptuous spread of fruit, wine, of course, on the side also in this container. But a closer inspection of this spread, right around here, we see a split pomegranate. Fruit that is not, if one looks over here, right next to it, fruit that looks, frankly, not all that fresh. Yes, fruit is being presented to us, but is it of the best quality? Is it the ripest? Perhaps not. These are the gifts of a garden, the garden of Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, also known as Dionysus. But the Garden of Dionysus is not the Garden of Eden. It does not have that innocence associated with it. Moving up a little bit, we see linens and a pillow that Dionysus or Bacchus is reclining on. These, frankly, look like they've been slept in and are not all that fresh looking themselves. Again, the use of light. The light is focused on the torso and face of Bacchus, and we see a little bit of shadow towards what he's surrounded by. Eating, by the way, from the bed. This, of course, is a reclining bed that he's using to consume this food and drink this wine. How should we say? It implies a bit of indulgence in the act. Traveling further up, one of the more telling objects in this painting, frankly, is this glass. It is telling for two main reasons. The first, on a simpler level, and the second on a more complex level. The glass, as you notice, is broad, and the container where actually the wine is actually sitting is more or less flat. If folks know a lot about wine or just a little bit about wine, this is not the best container to drink wine from. Basically, you are letting all of that great nose, that great, the smell that comes with the wine dissipate. You won't have it focused, as in contrast to having a tall, more narrowed glass. But it also is, how should I say, it also serves to be symbolic. It is a shallow glass, perhaps conveying that the gifts of the god of wine and revelry are not that profound, are not that deep, are not that articulate in that sense. They are shallow gifts when described. The second tell of this glass is that there is only one. It is meant for you, the viewer of this painting, whomever is seeing this painting from the front, not to share with anybody else. Dionysus or Bacchus is giving this only to you and not anybody next to you. There is only one, after all. There's not enough. There's not two for somebody else as well. You will have these gifts. You will have their delights. You will have more than someone else. Someone else will not enjoy the gifts of the god of wine and revelry, but you shall. Now, why is this noteworthy? Let's compare this to somewhere else where we see you, Y-O-U, used in language in a theological setting. In the Decalogue, the tablets that were given to Moses, the language used by God in conveying these 10 laws begin with you. Note that the language does not say you all or you whole bunch of people. It is very much you singular. What does this do? This establishes a connection between the source of the laws and each individual person. We are all engaging in a conversation with God when He is sharing these laws with us for our benefit and for the benefit of other people as well. So, you language. Here we see figurative you language, seen in the one glass of Dionysus. Dionysus is saying, look, I'm giving this to you. You should be happy because you're going to get this gift of revelry. But this particular gift, as we've seen before, might be of questionable value and frankly is also quite shallow, and it's not going to benefit anybody else. Maybe it benefits me if I'm drinking from this wine, but that's only if it's really good wine, hopefully. But it's not going to really benefit the person or the people around them. It is, in a way, a reverse message that you get when you language is used in the 10 Commandments. At the very top of the painting, as we move to Dionysus's head, the expression on Bacchus or Dionysus has been interpreted for many, many years as him slowly waking up from revelry himself. He's joined you in that great party, and he's waking up the next morning or perhaps noon, getting himself going ever so slightly. He is young, perhaps promising the gift of youth with his gift of revelry. Youth, which is a form of power, as it can be seen as something that cheats death, to be forever young in that sense. The wreath at Dionysus's head, not the kind of wreath you see on a Roman emperor, but a rather wild-looking one. It reminds us of Dionysus or Bacchus's true nature. True nature, the true nature of wildness and chaos. I mentioned earlier a Greek tragedy writer by the name of Sophocles, who is considered the greatest. He's the most subtle by Aristotle. I will share with you now another tragedy writer from ancient Greece, a man called Euripides, who wrote stories which perhaps can best be described as almost postmodern in their context and meaning. When we look at Dionysus and Bacchus, we realize there is not, that all this picture is conveying not all there is to this god. In Euripides's play called the Bacchae, Bacchae, Dionysus demands of an earthly king, the king of Thebes, Pentheus. He demands Pentheus to bow down to him because he wants respect as a new god. It is very important to note that Dionysus is presented by Euripides, the tragedy writer, as a god who comes from the East. If you're a Greek, the East meant a place that was beyond reason, that was mystical, that was magical, and that perhaps ought not be respected in the same way that Greek culture was. Dionysus or Bacchus demands Pentheus bow down to him because he wants respect. Unfortunately for Dionysus, he is disappointed. King Pentheus of Thebes refuses to bow down to this new god. So what happens to him? What happens to the king who refuses to pay respect to this new divinity? A spell is put on him by the god Bacchus or Dionysus. He is brought out into the wilderness. Now you have to remember that the followers of this new god have a very interesting way of worshiping him. They run through forests and they course animals. Coursing, by the way, is a very old sport. I believe it's been outlawed in the UK. It may still be done, I guess, on a more shady level, perhaps, or maybe perhaps more on a legal level. But it involves using hounds, primarily sight hounds, fast ones like greyhounds, to chase small animals. Chase these animals, and eventually, when they find these animals, rip them apart. The followers of Dionysus or Bacchus did this to animals in the play. They ran through forests with wild abandon, seized a deer, sheep, whatever they could find, and just ripped it apart. What is the purpose of this? Frankly, there isn't one. This is simply one of the ways in which Bacchus is worshipped. What happens to poor King Pentheus? A spell is put on him. He ends up being chased by these followers of Dionysus, who themselves are under a spell, believing him to be an animal and not a king. They eventually find him. They eventually catch him. And when they do, they render him limb from limb, with perhaps the most bitter message, adding insult to injury. The main follower of Dionysus, who literally decapitates the king, is his own mother, who is one of Dionysus's followers. I remember reading this as a freshman at college in Annapolis many, many years ago. We had to read the play in English and then translate Greek parts of it. And I ended up reading this and sort of putting the book down. Well, we still use books back then, but back in the old days, putting the book down and saying, this is a pointless tragedy. What exactly is the point of this? What is trying to be, what is Euripides, the author, trying to convey? It seems like a pointless, senseless tragedy, replete with violence, replete with passion and senselessness. What exactly is the message here? Well, when we think of Lewis, it all sorts of makes sense. It was Pentheus's pride as a king who refused to bow down to this new god from the East. Pentheus basically saying to Bacchus, to Dionysus, you are not as good as these Olympian gods. You are not of the same quality, so I'm not going to give you the respect I give them. Well, of course, that led to his own suffering and his demise. But more importantly, it was Dionysus or Bacchus's pride that demanded the act of this king being caught and torn apart by his own mother, a pointless form of punishment. Dionysus himself can fall victim to pride. For all of his great power over his followers who commit senseless acts of violence, who some of them inebriate themselves in these drunken revelries that Dionysus sponsors, for all of the power that he himself is vulnerable to pride. Make no mistake and be under no illusion. The god of spilt wine is also the god of spilt blood. Any questions or comments on this Caravaggio painting and this section in which Lewis is covering pride as the ultimate sin?
Just an observation as an Irishman that there is a full carafe at our right hand.
Yes, there is a rather full carafe over here. So if this shallow cup runneth dry, then we can always get more on the side. Very good.
No, I just looking at it's a very effeminate looking initially.
Yes.
But it is the effeminacy is removed by the shoulder and the muscles in the arm.
Very much so.
Yeah, it intrigued me when I saw it first because I've never seen this one before. And the color of the face and the hair and everything, it looks so effeminate, and yet the arm is definitely powerful looking arm with lots of biceps and other muscles as well. So it's kind of the antithesis of what I would expect if we were looking at either a man or a woman.
Yes. So perhaps the point of Caravaggio in conveying this almost, I don't want to call it cherubic face, but it's a very young face with the blushed cheeks, conveying either youth or some sense of inebriation. But this very burly shoulder and arm and forearm, it's almost like they don't fit. They don't go together in that sense.
Yes, and that's the point I was making.
Well said. Well taken in that sense. Very good. Any other questions or comments on this Caravaggio painting and Lewis's points on pride?
It seems to me that we can be guilty of pride even if we don't have a will to power. That we can, I don't know that I know how to say this, but we can be proud of our being more charitable than someone else, or being proud of more virtuous in other ways, which completely undermines the virtue, in my opinion.
Yes.
And even though there's nothing about power. Earlier on, there was a mention that the ultimate goal of pride was power. And I think I agree with that. I think there's a lot of insidious pride that has nothing to do with power.
Okay. How would that take form, that insidious pride that does not have to do with power?
In my own life, if I am giving to something and I hear that someone else has given less than I have, there's that little something that says, oh my, you did more. And I find that very disconcerting and difficult to eradicate.
Very good. It's a sense of being proud of how good one is being.
Could be, yes.
I've given more than somebody else. So maybe I care more about a charity than X person, right? Who only gave 5, whereas I gave 10 in that sense. So I see where you're going, and I think it's a very interesting point in that you're not wanting power in that situation or dominion over someone, but you are still having some sense of superiority.
Exactly.
Even if the superiority deals in virtue.
And even if it's only in my head, nowhere else.
Right. So it is something perhaps to at least reflect on and perhaps avoid if it does come up in that sense.
Yes.
I see your earlier point being that pride can sometimes be not related entirely to quests for power or a will to power, like Nietzsche's, for instance, in that it can be reflected not as in somebody trying to, some example comes to mind. I often tell my Western civilization history students that all throughout history, you hear of people who long to be called great. Alexander, Caesar. Well, Alexander literally is the great. Some of my students think it's his last name. But then you have Caesar, you have Napoleon, all of these men vying for dominance over the world. That is, of course, pride in that sense of you thirsting for power. But a feeling of moral superiority over some other person, whereas you're not even trying to conquer the world or even trying to conquer your neighborhood or your town, but that simple feeling of elevation over somebody else by means of having more virtue than they have is also reflective of this, yes? And I would kind of agree, it is particularly insidious in that we can guard against the thirst for power, but these small feelings we have in our heads when we believe that we've done more than somebody else, perhaps could lead us astray in that sense. Excellent point. Thank you. Any questions and comments further on this third section of the presentation?
The word that comes to me, to mind, to my thoughts here, is the word hubris. The defiance of the pride that is in defiance of the gods, of not recognizing our dependence on them and thinking that we can run our own lives independent of any transcendent being.
Yes. Borrowing from what you just said, which I think is an excellent point, could we say that the gods themselves are capable of hubris?
The Roman gods or the ones we believe in?
Well, no, I mean, the Greco-Roman, or since we're talking about Dionysus or Bacchus, could they also fall prey to this?
I presume so.
With the one difference, right, is that we don't live long enough to never suffer for our transgressions. We will always suffer for our hubris in that sense. Whereas the gods may suffer temporary. There are gods who are wounded in the Iliad, who are physically wounded, but they've got forever to get over it. It's okay. It's not going to matter to them. But it seems like they themselves are capable of falling short of some sort of moral standard because of hubris. Zeus does not have a very good relationship with Hera because, well, Zeus tends to spread himself rather broadly amongst the female population of the earth. Hera is not very happy about that. So if there was not some sort of standard of pride or hubris, then Hera would have nothing to be mad about. So even the gods themselves, at a certain point, clash against this standard. In a way, they are not the authors of what is right and wrong. They are also subject to it, as we are. Okay, so we go now to our last portion of the presentation, which is Lewis presenting an antidote to this problem of pride and sin, and that is found in the concept of charity, the theological virtue of charity. If I could draw your attention to page 131 in the reading. This is, of course, in the chapter named Charity itself. We're looking for a sentence beginning with the rule for all of us. It begins on the previous page with a paragraph beginning with, but through natural likings. The rule for all of us is perfectly simple. Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love him. If you injure someone you dislike, you will find yourself disliking him more. If you do him a good turn, you will find yourself disliking him less. There is indeed one exception. If you do him a good turn, not to please God and obey the law of charity, but to show him what a fine, forgiving chap you are, and to put him in your debt, then sit down to wait for this gratitude, you will probably be disappointed. People are not fools. They have a very quick eye for anything like showing off or patronage. But whenever we do good to another self, just because it is a self, made like us by God, desiring its own happiness as we desire ours, we shall have learned to love it a little more, or at least to dislike it less. On the next page, this is on page 132, a paragraph beginning with, it is actually the last paragraph of the charity chapter. The last paragraph beginning with on the whole. On the whole, God's love for us is a much safer subject to think about than our love for him. Nobody can always have devout feelings. And even if we could, feelings are not what God principally cares about. Christian love, either towards God or towards man, is an affair of the will. If we are trying to do his will, we are obeying the commandment, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God." He will give us feelings of love if he pleases. We cannot create them for ourselves, and we must not demand them as a right. But the great thing to remember is that, though our feelings come and go, his love for us does not. It is not wearied by our sins or our indifference, and therefore it is quite relentless in its determination that we shall be cured of those sins, at whatever cost to us, at whatever cost to him. From Lewis, the potential affinity for someone is secondary to acting as if someone already was a loved one. Feelings of affinity are an outcome of the action. Acting out love is not dependent on feelings which may change. We should, however, avoid doing this to subordinate others or someone else or others because of this apparent show of generosity. He warns about being showy about this. We learn to love more when we act to benefit another. Thomas Aquinas would say the same, acknowledging we share commonality in being creations of God. God views Christian love toward himself or fellow human beings as an affair of the will. This is what Lewis says. If he pleases, we may get these good feelings from him, but we can't create them, or we can't demand them as well as our right. As our feelings change, God's love does not, even at great cost to himself. As a philosopher by training, one of the more profound days of the year, at least for me, is Good Friday. In a sense where I usually, if I do have the opportunity, visit a local church and sit down as the Stations of the Cross are being read. I usually sit down there quietly and think to myself, okay, if we follow what Aquinas said in his 5 proofs of the existence of, that God is being himself, is existence itself, that chooses to come to earth, a mortal being, in order to share our human life and eventually to sacrifice himself for us. The thought of God, the creator of everything, of being himself, so lowering himself to be flogged by men who don't know any better, who have no clue of what they're doing, it is such an act of generosity that it really does boggle my philosopher's mind. I can't even wrap my mind around it. That act of generosity is so large to be even conceivable. Lewis is saying in this chapter that if we concern ourselves with feelings, this is a hint that we are really concerned with ourselves. The feelings will come, but acting as if you love or care about somebody for their benefit or for their betterment is what is important. This last painting, I'm very happy to share with you, is actually from my home country in the Philippines. This is found at the National Museum of the Philippines. It is entitled El Tránsito del Glorioso Patriarca San José. Translation into English, The Passing of the Glorious Patriarch Saint Joseph. It was painted in the mid-1800s, more likely around 1840s or so. The artist who painted this was Justiniano Asuncion y Molo. Asuncion was a painter and politician between 1816, well, he was born in 1816, passing away in 1896. Essentially the last century of Spanish rule over the Philippines. He was from a wealthy Chinese Filipino family and had 5 brothers who were themselves artists of renown. He was eventually elected head of a Spanish municipal office, which elevated, of course, his standing in society during this time period. He was a student in 1834 at an institution called Escuela de Dibujo, which is now known as the University of the Philippines College of Fine Arts. And he studied there under the painting master Damian Domingo, who is considered the father of Philippine painting. Since we are discussing charity, the theme that you see here in front of you is very particular to Philippine religious art. It was a theme that was present from the mid-1600s to the latter part of the 19th century. Essentially from the mid-1600s, which is roughly 100 years of Spanish rule of the Philippines, all the way to the end of Spanish rule of the Philippines in 1898. It is unique, and I'll say this anecdotally, having viewed a fair amount of religious art in many countries in Europe, it is unique in that it is not overly found present in other places apart from the Philippines, as far as this theme goes. It was present in homes. One of the unique things about this form of art, or this theme, not necessarily in churches, but this theme was found in homes, in houses in the Philippines, from the homes of the wealthy, where people would have their own private chapels, and paintings of this sort would be ensconced in these chapels, or more humble, more modest homes, where a small area for reflection would be separated, and works of this variety would be placed there. Joseph was often invoked. The reason for these paintings being in homes was that Saint Joseph was often invoked during the time of death. He was surrounded himself at his own deathbed by Jesus and Mary of the Holy Family, in keeping with very deep Filipino familial ties, the idea that we should all be surrounding those we care about when they no longer, when they will be passing from this life. This from the cultural center of the Philippines, these descriptions, we see the loving kindness and intimacy of Jesus and the sadness of Mary, both present in this painting. If we look at the other parts of this painting, we find angels. One here holding something rather unique. It's a basket with carpenter's tools, symbolic again of what Joseph's job was on this earth, apart from being father in the Holy Family. If we look a little bit higher, it's a little bit perhaps too bright, but there is a bearded figure up here and wings of a dove over here forming a V. That, of course, is the Holy Spirit being both above, waiting in anticipation of this passing. Mary can be found sorrowfully clutching her handkerchief. She is crowned with stars. This scene in particular was quite evocative when I saw this painting for the first time. It reminds me of an old, very old song. It's an old Marian hymn. It's about 1,000 years old. Its name is the Salve Regina, or the Hail Holy Queen in English. It is a song that is traditionally performed during the funerals of priests. The most famous, of course, example of this was it being performed by the pallbearers of John Paul II, the Pope who passed away, and as they were bringing his coffin into the crypt. It is a rather beautiful song, the Salve Regina. In English, it was taught, I believe in English and Spanish, it was taught at Catholic schools in the Philippines for many, many years. I was speaking with my sister Teresa about this some time back, and we touched on this song, and she was able to, word for word, give me the English lines for it much better than I could do it. So it very much ingrained in Filipino Catholic culture. There's a beautiful line in it. I'll give you the Latin version of this and the translation. It is a song to Mary. And the line goes, part of this whole song, Ad te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. To thee do we send our sighs, mourning and weeping in this vale of tears. In this vale of tears, which is earthly life. What is unique about the Holy Family is that they share with us the joys and pain of mortal life. Our sufferings, they know as well. At a moment of death, there is weeping. At a moment of death, there is relationship, there is togetherness of this family. Think of the theological virtues, of which charity is, as being very different from the Greco-Roman pagan virtues. Why? The Greco-Roman virtues like prudence, like courage, like justice or temperance, these are things I want to acquire. I want to bring to me. The theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, love, these things emit from the individual. We send out from us. We don't take, we give. And the representation of this we find in the Holy Family at the time of the death of St. Joseph. We see Jesus as well, right over here, his head touching Joseph's, his hand with his finger above pointing towards everlasting life, and his arm gently holding Joseph's own hand, acknowledging the man who chose to be his father and protector of the Holy Family. A monumental, by the way, task. Saint Joseph is called two very interesting things by the Catholic Church. He is called the greatest male saint because it was to him that was entrusted the task of taking care of the Holy Family. But he is also called, very curiously, considering that his job, he was a carpenter. But Saint Joseph is also called the terror of demons. He did not achieve classical pagan virtues, which are perhaps more susceptible to pride, because they seek greatness to come toward the self. Instead, Joseph practiced charity, the theological virtue which is a gift from God and which is meant to be shared with others. That is its purpose. He followed and did what God willed. Simple as that. He actually doesn't say a whole lot in the New Testament, in the Bible. We simply know him because of his actions. There is an interesting exchange in another Lewis work, that being the Screwtape Letters. An exchange between demons, an older to a younger, with the older trying to explain to the younger how to best tempt or bring a human being into sin. The advice was to convince a man with this act of sin, with this small act, because sin is traveled slowly on a paved road, so to speak. With this small act, he will get everything, when in reality, he gets nothing. Now, Saint Joseph, the terror of demons, would have nothing of this temptation, electing instead to do something very simple, to love his wife and his son as God loved him. This is one of about 2 or 3 paintings, by the way, that I saw at the Manila National Museum, which had this very same theme of the passing of Saint Joseph. Quite unique, I would say, in the world of religious art.
Jose, how many angels are there, and are they supposed to be representing particular things or virtues or care for the Holy Family?
It's a great question. I see 1, 2, 3, and barely, I think the paint is worn out over here, another. So perhaps 4 in total. I don't think the number is necessarily symbolic. I see this one over here as holding some form of decoration, or some form of flower or a gift or rod over Joseph, one carrying his gifts. The other, very interestingly, holding above what looks like almost the kind of drape that you find in a theater, like at the end of a show almost, when it's held up and people retreat back and come back for another round of applause. So perhaps, just a guess on my part, this one holding up this large cloth was symbolic of the passing of something is ending during this time period. Joseph's life is ending.
Is this a theme that has been painted by other than Hispanic artists I've ever seen before?
Yes, to my knowledge and my research, there are more than one artist in the Philippines who have done this, of the passing of Saint Joseph. So Asuncion, who's the painter of this, is one. There are others in the Philippines. But frankly, and I guess I could probably travel more and look at more museums, I have not really seen it in other religious art in Europe, for instance, in the various museums I've been to over there. So it seems to be a particularly Filipino thematic setting in art.
Thank you.
Sure. A hand up?
Are there other scenes that are done by the same artist of other aspects of other moments in the life of the Holy Family?
Oh, that is a great question. I will have to research that further. I mean, if he did some other
It looks almost as, because I think you're exactly right that this is a theatrical curtain that's here, because that's a proscenium arch above, as though it's a theatrical scene. And I wondered if it was a series of different scenes.
I can research this further and get back to you. If you'd always send an email via the Lewis Society, and I can do my best to get back to you on that. So far as I can tell from my own research, I only saw this one particular painting exhibited solo.
Okay, you don't need to do a tremendous amount of research on this.
Sure.
I won't get.
Willing to try. Okay.
It was just a question of interest if you have known about this. Yeah.
No problem. Sure. Any further questions and comments?
I'm going back. I'm sorry, but I can't get it out of my mind about what the point was for the second principle of the virtues. And perfect virtue separates you from others. So the more perfect your virtue is, the more you're separate from others.
Well, that
is
holds.
That a bad thing then?
Well, sure. That line of reasoning holds for the Greco-Roman pagan virtues, which are that they are things to be acquired. Yes, I want to be wise. I want to be a wiser person, a more courageous person. So I aspire to these virtues. The difference with the theological virtues is that they are not acquired. They are gifts from God. And the purpose to them is for us to share them with other people. Not to hold them as a dear possession, to put them up on the mantelpiece and to just let them, acquire dust. But the theological virtues are specifically made to benefit ourselves and other people in a relationship as well.
Yeah, that was the missing piece that was really bothering me. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Further questions and comments?
I'm dealing like you are now with children and with grandchildren, and the philosophies that we've been through a couple of these now with you, and I appreciate very much what you're doing. But C.S. Lewis, and we're talking about decency and reverence. Would there be an opportunity in a future venue to address how our children and our grandchildren are accepting his philosophies, of decency and reverence and prudence? Would that be an appropriate venue for something time to come? Because I don't see a lot of it. I see reactions nowadays that are contrary totally to what we are discussing and what you are discussing and teaching us here, is that the young children are inclined to blame us for our, they call us their deficiencies in our way of thinking that go back to, C.S. Lewis and others who have a very different view from their point of view at the present time. Just something for a future debate, maybe.
I'll be very open to something along those lines and researching further as to what could happen. I think if I could channel Lewis briefly, I would think that Lewis would probably say, the best we can do under whatever circumstance we find ourselves in is to act out those theological virtues as best we can. And if they stick with somebody who says, hey, there's something to this, and there's something special in this act of generosity, then maybe I should follow it. But, expecting it to stick everywhere and for every lesson to be learned is perhaps not that realistic. But I guess the idea is at least try to serve as an example in whatever small way we can, in acting out our care for other people, that we value them for what they are in totality. That we show our love by wanting their betterment in that sense. If we act in that way, at least that's what we're being called to do.
Putting my face on now to say congratulations, because that was an excellent answer, and that's all we can do, I think, is portray the virtues that your philosophy and his philosophy portray for them, but they may not. They're increasingly less liable to follow those principles, I think, in these days, and maybe we could do even a little bit better.
Yes, Tolkien, who wrote, of course, The Lord of the Rings and was very good friends with Lewis, there's an interesting line that he uses about this sort of progression of life in Middle Earth and how things go from bad to worse. And he calls this the long defeat. Basically, that we shouldn't really expect to somehow, in an earthly manner, win. So your job is not really to sort of be victorious. It's to be observant and to be faithful as best we can. And if others take from that example positive things, then those are things to be proud of, but not in a prideful way. At least those small victories.
Yeah, because my complete answer as an older man now, dealing with all of these younger people, my most frequent comment to them, there is a God.
Yes.
Because I'm not sure they are sure there is a God.
It's what I sometimes do with students is I ask them, if you can tell me if an act is right or wrong. Students are very, very quick to say yes or no. Yes, this is right, this is wrong. But they are very, very, how should I say, hesitant or reluctant when I begin asking the question, how do you know? Because if you say, for instance, that life is unjust, then you must have a conception in you of what justice means. And this had to come from somewhere, because if you just made it up yourself, you will have a different definition of justice than I do. At which point justice becomes subjective and meaningless. So where do these standards come from? By what standard are you judging things to be faulty or excellent? And if you keep following the breadcrumbs, you ultimately hit or find the source of where this goodness emanates from. And the theological virtues are useful because they are literally emittive virtues. They emit from God to us. And we are asked to emit it as well to other people.
Yeah, because C.S. Lewis did not have children or grandchildren. Like you, I know you have children,
yeah.
but not grandchildren quite yet, but they're coming. And it's a challenge for all of us. And you and I are very good friends, as you know.
Yes.
And maybe we need to have lunch over this.
I'll be very happy to. Very happy as well. Thank you.
A sense of virtues, of what the virtues are in the youth, I believe is a very old question. I believe it was quite a subject for the Greeks themselves, as to how do you inculcate virtues. And to a certain extent, although C.S. Lewis did not have children of his own, as you just pointed out, you could see almost his whole project of his theological works, but particularly his fiction works, as an effort to demonstrate to young people, or to the next generations, or to us, what those Christian virtues would look like.
Well, very, very excellent point. I think what you said about the Greeks earlier is particularly noteworthy. The dilemma the Greeks had in trying to inculcate virtue is that in the at least in the Greek mind, not even the Roman mind yet, but in the older Greek mind, there really is no salvation. You all end up basically going to Hades. Unless the gods are kind of fickle and kind of like you may end up in the Elysian fields, perhaps. But most people will end up in Hades, where you will be a shade wafting, across time forever. Not particularly inspiring, an afterlife. So Plato goes around this by saying, you should look at virtues as rewards in themselves. You're not doing good things so you'll be rewarded later on. The act of being a just person is itself a reward, because it means that your soul, so constructed and so ordered, is functioning well, because they could not provide anything past that point. So if you add that to the Romans, and eventually you have people like Plutarch, who will write biographies of the noble Greeks and Romans. These were read to show us, where does Alexander do the right thing? Where does he go wrong? Where does Caesar do the right thing? And where is he excessive? So these are earthly examples of virtues lived. But at the same time, the virtues themselves are very, as I mentioned earlier, are exceptional but they are isolating. They do not encourage relationship. Whereas the theological virtues are all about relationship, are all about giving and sharing with others.
Yes.
Any further questions and comments on the presentation?
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, of course. Well, thanks very much, all. It was very nice to meet you, and we'll prepare for another show next year with some more visuals. I hope that works out as well.
Thank you so much, Jose, and we'll see you all next week. Good night.
Thank you.